Hello, I've lived in the city of Chicago now for about 9 years, and recently it came to my attention that there are one or two myths that spread around the internet about this very city, from great fires to pizza, and sometimes fires as a result of making pizza in my case. So if you are the sort of American that likes hearing a foreigner talk about your country and you haven't yet subscribed to this channel, do that now. In the meantime, let's talk Chicago myths. Before I moved here, I had family members saying things like, "Lawrence, be careful. This place where you're going to is an absolute war zone. Never leave your house and make sure you don't talk to anybody." And a few weeks living here, I realised they had a point. If you've ever tried cycling on the Lakeshore Trail in the heat of summer, you really have to watch out for fellow cyclists. But other than that, those warnings that came from family members as well as the media seem to be at odds with everything around me. There are vast expanses of this city that almost feel too calm for my liking. I need a bit of excitement. Like certainly here, close to downtown and even downtown, everyone's really nice. But I have to say, I lived in Indianapolis for 3 years and I felt less safe there. And that's saying something because 95% of the time I felt fine there too. It's just it had small pockets that you had to avoid, and the same is true here. But even then, I've been to various parts of the south side and the west side and found those bits to be pleasant as well. So what I'm saying is, it's like any other city that I've ever lived in, including London. Yeah, you have some bad parts, but that small percentage should not cloud the fact that most of it is quite beautiful. I think people get hung up on the so-called dangers of Chicago because of the raw numbers when it comes to crime. But you got to remember that this is a highly populated city. Yeah, of course the raw numbers of crime are going to be high, perhaps too high even for us. But if you break that down by per capita statistics, Chicago is not as high as people think. Let's look at some numbers. According to the most recent FBI data compilations, Chicago's homicide rate in 2024 was about 17.5 murders per 100,000 residents. For transparency, that's still above the national average, so clearly there's work to be done, but that puts it behind more than 20 cities in the US in terms of per capita murder rate. Cities like Memphis, Tennessee, St. Louis, Missouri, and Birmingham, Alabama, where the rate is significantly higher. Secondly, when you look at violent crime overall, Chicago doesn't even make the top 90. That's on top of the fact that crime in Chicago has been falling. In 2025, homicides are on track to be the lowest in the city for more than a decade. Now, as a YouTube sensation who has a house in Chicago, it could be easy to be paranoid about leaving it while I film. But I only say that because of how much our data ends up online. That's right. Somewhere out there, hundreds of data brokers are collecting and selling my personal information, my address, my email, my online habits, all without me ever giving them permission. And it's not just me. People search sites can publish your personal details for anyone to see. It's disturbingly easy for strangers or scammers to find you with a quick search. Removing yourself from those sites by yourself would take hundreds of hours, and the data would just pop back up anyway. That is why I've been using Incogni, the service that automatically contacts these data brokers on your behalf and asks them to delete your personal information. For me, Incogni has reached out to over 600 data brokers, which is a frankly staggering number, and if new ones appear, or my data resurfaces, they'll take it down again. If you go for their unlimited plan, you can even point them toward any website where your data shows up, and their team will handle it. It's always just so eye-opening to see how many companies had my data in the first place, and how quickly Incogni started clearing them out. So do what I did. Take control of your data. Head to incogni.com/lostinthepond and get an impressive 60% discount on Incogni's annual plan by using the code LOSTINTHEPOND. The link is in my description below. All that said, while this place is not the war zone that it's depicted to be, it did once look like one. Particularly after the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. And when you live in this city, that is a historic event that you hear about time and time again. And there are two myths in particular that are associated with that fire that I want to discuss right here. The first of those is that it was started by a clumsy cow. It's one of those stories everyone thinks they know. In 1871, a cow belonging to a Mrs. O'Leary kicked over a lantern and poof, Chicago went up in flames. Except it's probably nonsense. Yes, there was a Mrs. O'Leary, Catherine O'Leary, an Irish immigrant living on the city's southwest side. And yes, she owned a cow. And yes, the fire did start at her barn. But the official inquiry into the Great Chicago Fire never found proof that she, her husband, or the cow were culpable. In fact, the cow theory actually came from a newspaper reporter who later admitted he'd made it up because, quote, it made for a better story. And in 1871, O'Leary herself was a convenient target. Anti-Irish prejudice was rampant in the United States, where the myth fit neatly deeply into the stereotypes of the day. As for Daisy, or whatever her name was, she became Chicago's most infamous scape cow. However, in 1997, the Chicago City Council officially pardoned both Mrs. O'Leary and the cow, and to this day, the true cause of the fire has never been determined. So I hope that brings some closure to the cow's descendants and that they get fed extra grass this week. But before I moved here, I'd always heard that the Great Chicago Fire was so bad it decimated the entire city, which is kind of hard to do when much of the city is waterways. But the truth is, only about a third of the city burned down during that fire, and when you think about it, given a city of this size, that's still a lot. Now, granted, that third did include much of downtown, so the destruction looked catastrophic. But if you'd ventured to the south side or the far west side, you'd have still found plenty of Chicago standing, along with presumably a few confused cows wondering what all the fuss was about. But the fire was devastating, killing roughly 300 people and leaving 100,000 homeless. But Chicago didn't vanish. In fact, the city's rapid rebuilding became one of the great urban success stories of the 19th century. Within 2 decades, it was hosting the 1893 World's Fair, where, among other things, George Washington Gale Ferris unveiled a huge wheel bearing his name, the first of its kind in the world. Anyway, from great fires to wood fires, let's talk pizza. I think sometimes when I speak to people that don't live in Chicago, there might be this notion that we Chicagoans eat Chicago-style pizza all the time. Indeed, when I first moved here, I lived just around the corner from a pizza shop that has since closed, from where initially, due to the novelty of the entire thing, we ordered Chicago-style pizza about once a day for a whole week. Ended up throwing up, not because Chicago pizza is bad, but because it's so much. Chicago-style pizza is deep dish pizza. I haven't looked it up, but I imagine it's quite a bit higher in calories than a New York style, for example. And so over the years, just talking to Chicagoans about it, I get the impression that we view it as this thing that you have once in a while, as a treat, or for a special occasion. It's not something that you're going to eat every day because you would probably die and spill all of the red tomato paste down you, which would make Chicago look like a war zone. I personally try it when A, I'm in the mood, or B, we have friends visit and they say, Lawrence, can we get Chicago style? All right, suppose you'll want to do the architectural tour as well. Of course, I really like to surprise those visitors by taking them to an area of Chicago they didn't think was possible. Come with me. And that is beaches. Now, I'll admit, this one is a bit less of a myth and more of a surprise. Before I moved here, I didn't think that Chicago was the Miami of the Midwest, just without the sun. So at one point, Chicago not having a beach was a myth to me. But it turns out, it doesn't just have this one next to Lakeshore Drive, but countless others up the coast. Believe it or not, Chicago is home to 26 miles of shoreline and more than 24 beaches along Lake Michigan, all with real sand, real lifeguards, and occasionally real seagulls stealing your chips. In true Chicago fashion, we didn't want to wait 4 million years for nature to give us a coastline, so we built our own. Starting in the late 1800s, the city extended its shoreline with landfill and concrete seawalls, and then dumped an astonishing amount of sand, much of which was brought in from Indiana, on top. The result? Some of the most striking urban beaches in the world, from Oak Street Beach, where I am in this video, to Montrose Beach, where dogs and hipsters coexist peacefully. Of course, this is Chicago, so beach season is roughly the length of a polite handshake. Anyway, I'm going to walk a few miles that way back to the other camera. Of course, on days like today, when it's quite windy out and you're experiencing fall weather, the beach is the last place that you want to be. And pound for pound, Chicago is a very windy city. But contrary to popular belief, that's not the only reason the name persists. It's true that it appeared in print for the first time in connection with the weather. However, the story in question pertained to a tornado rather than Chicago's general windy disposition. Instead, the nickname was popularized further in the 1890s, when Chicago was locked in a bitter rivalry with New York over who would host the 1893 World's Fair. New York journalists, ever the charmers, mocked Chicago's politicians as being windy or full of hot air for bragging about their city. The insult stuck, and soon the whole country was using it. Ironically, the so-called Windy City went on to win that bid, built the fairgrounds that became Jackson Park, and introduced the world to the Ferris wheel. Not bad for a place supposedly full of bluster. And so, despite what every tourist brochure and weather app might imply, the nickname has less to do with wind and more to do with ego. So there we have it. Chicago has a very confusing nickname. Actually, it has two. Because shortly after I moved here, I discovered that Second City is not just a comedy troupe that basically gave us Saturday Night Live. That troupe was named after a 20th century nickname for this city, and I thought to myself, well, that's quirky, isn't it? And I also thought, being a curious person, why do we call it that? Well, initially, the name came down to population rankings. After the Great Fire, Chicago rose from the ashes, quite literally, and by the turn of the 20th century had become the nation's second most populous city behind New York. This led another New York journalist to coin the phrase Second City in 1952, not as a compliment, of course, but as a jab, suggesting Chicago was always playing catch-up with New York, but he was completely and utterly a little bit wrong, because we're actually now playing catch-up with Los Angeles, which exceeded our population in 1984. Therefore, in this sense, it is a myth to say we are the second city. Nonetheless, the term stuck, partly because of Chicago's expertise at taking an insult and turning it into a badge of honor, but also because the name echoed the city's second incarnation, its rebirth after the Great Fire. Of course, for me personally, after living in the United States for 17 years, it is now my first city, and it's for that reason that I wanted to dispel some of those myths. Thanks for watching, and if you like watching me talk about particular cities of the United States, here's me visiting Des Moines, Iowa. You'll watch that video next. Until the next video, goodbye.